Hello, everybody, and welcome to another UKC panel discussion. I'm Louis, and I'm joined, of course, by Maddy and Neil. Hello, Maddy. Hello, Neil. How are you both?
All right.
And today we're going to be talking about advanced fingerboarding. So we've had our beginners fingerboarding. We talked about motivation during lockdown. Last week we were talking about movement, and this week all about advanced fingerboarding. And we were talking just before this session started about what exactly the definition of an advanced fingerboarder might be. And so, yeah, we're just talking about, okay, so at what point do we think people are moving from beginners fingerboarding to the more advanced stuff that we're talking about today? When would this become more relevant to them? Maddy, you want to talk first for a bit?
Yeah, so I think this is always a really tricky one because some people I know, first session on the fingerboard, they can hang more than I can now. Yet I would consider myself someone who needs to think about the more advanced sessions or protocols or like theories behind fingerboarding. And the reason I think that is because I have been fingerboarding for a number of years. So I built up that like training experience. I guess I've gone through the more basic protocols that we talked about last time, building up to body weight on a fingerboard, starting with some basic max hang protocols. And then I reached a point where that plateaued off. And I guess that's what comes with a certain amount of training experience on a fingerboard, is that you realize you need to start maybe varying stimulus a bit to continue to get that progression. So I think it's really hard to pin to a certain grade or thing, but I guess when you're first starting out within like the first year, perhaps of fingerboarding, you can probably stick to quite the basic protocols that are there. And then I start to get to a point, I guess it's what we might speak about today, where you might plateau or you might feel you want to make it more specific to your goals. And that's where you might start to think about these more advanced concepts in fingerboarding. So I guess like it's sort of a bit of an individual basis, but potentially people started fingerboarding last lockdown. They built a lot of experience over the year and we're back where we started a year later. So this might be a good chance for people to explore some of the more, the different concepts we're going to talk about today. How about you, Neil?
Well, I completely concur with that. I mean, all I would just to say that I think as a result of lockdown, we now have climbers that are relatively advanced in fingerboarding and not so advanced in actually climbing. I mean, I received benchmark stats from someone the other day who I looked at the benchmark stats and I was like, oh, this is a V7, V8 climber. And they were bouldering V2. And I was like, whoa, what's going on? And it was purely because this chap got into climbing a year ago. You know, he's been fingerboarding. So this is not a typical situation. But don't we just know at the best of times that you've got kind of climbing grade and fingerboarding ability and they kind of go like this. So, you know, I guess we're talking about that kind of sweet spot somewhere in the middle where this climber's maybe got 2 or 3 years of experience. They're maybe bouldering into the kind of middle V grade, sort of 5, 6-ish. And they can do some of those kind of gold standard tests that we climbers like to talk about, such as, you know, hanging the 20 mil slots on the bottom corners of the 1000 for 10 seconds, or maybe even the top corner slots if they're a bit of a hero. But that type of thing, as Maddy says, you know, body weight with a good, strict, solid half crimp. And, you know, they've been doing that for a while. They've been doing the max hangs and they're like, okay, what's next?
Perfect. So yeah, as these two are saying, this episode will be super helpful if either you've just fingerboarded for a long time and you feel like you've learned a lot about it and want to start learning these more I don't know if I'm going to say rarer approaches to fingerboarding, but I suppose slightly more novel approaches. Or if you're just super strong and you want to get a bit more specific with the training, then yeah, hopefully some good stuff. But I thought we'd start with just asking what your personal experiences with what your personal experiences have been with progressing in your own fingerboarding. What approaches have you found the most useful? What mistakes have you made along the way? Neil, have you got anything to share with us?
Okay, so when, you know, back in the day when I started climbing, I've sort of dust the cobwebs off the memories here. It was in the height of the sort of cellar climbing. I was in Sheffield. This wasn't when I started climbing, but this is when I started moving up through the grades. And I went to Sheffield and everyone was climbing on boards in their cellars. And that was kind of thought of as the way to get strong. And there was this one guy, this crazy guy called Matt Smith. He was a bit of a sort of training guru and he was very kind of theory based. And he was like, no, it's all about fingerboards. And while everyone was climbing on cellar boards, he was doing all this really measured, structured stuff, different finger combinations, you know, front 3, back 2, all this kind of stuff. Everyone just thought he was mad. You know, everyone just used to laugh at this guy. And the funny thing is that sure enough, he wasn't able to quite put his money where his mouth was, because he hardly ever climbed. He hardly ever put on his rock shoes because he was always fingerboarding. And so, of course, everyone concluded he was wrong, of course, strength-based training for climbing needs to involve some sort of climbing. And this guy was kind of like written out of the picture. But what's really funny is the way, 20 years, 25 years on, it's all gone around about circle. And now some of the stuff that we see almost leads you to believe that fingerboarding is the way forward. And I see a lot of this guy, Matt Smith's methodology, is now, he was one of the first guys to use it. I mean, I guess the Beastmaker crew really popularized this methodology with like finger isolation training. And to bring it back to the question, which was what's my personal experience, I guess I was of that kind of mindset that I thought I didn't really want a fingerboard. I thought it sounded a bit dull. I prefer climbing. And if I'm being told that that's the best way to get strong anyway, and I'm also seeing climbers, people like Tyler Landman, who, got to like V15 without ever touching a fingerboard, I'm thinking, well, that's good enough for me. However, the turning point for me was when I kind of met and started climbing with Dan Varian a little bit, who's the one of the sort of top guys behind Beastmaker, and he's also like a V14, 15 boulderer himself. And he did some sort of diagnostic stuff with me, and he's like, look, Gresham, you're a classic old school crimper. Every time you get a hold, you lock your thumb over the top. And he's like, take your thumb off. And I just went like that. And he was like, well, that's, with respect, he's like, that's not super handy for you on a lot of different types of holds. And I said, yeah, I know. That's why I avoid those holds. And he was like, look, come on, mate, let's have a go with this. And he got me doing some of the really basic stuff, which was trying to hold this classic half crimp without allowing the index to straighten. And of course I could barely do it. I was hopeless at it. And it was like a weakness that I just put to one side and avoided. And he was like, well, do this. And he's like, better still, take your pinky off. So you're doing it front three. So you're really, really focusing the work on keeping that index finger bent at 90. And he was like, I'm not telling you to stop climbing. Don't do what Matt Smith did. Don't sell your climbing shoes. He was like, just chip away at this. And don't do it all year round, because that's counterproductive anyway. Do it in little phases. Then kind of go just back to climbing more generally, and then drop it back in, do it for another couple of months maybe. And so I was like, okay, I'm going to go with this. And I trust this guy as well. He really sounds like he knows what he's talking about. And, 'cause we hear a lot of stuff, don't we? And with this, and I just suddenly felt my climbing improving. I felt more like kind of just solid on certain types of holds, certainly slightly more open holds. But even when I was crimping, I felt better. I was getting less pumped. My elbows felt better. I felt less tweaky, and it was just spiraling like this. And because I've been climbing such a long time, I've tried a lot of different things, and this was clearly something new that I was doing, and I was seeing direct benefits as a result of it. This is barely a conversation about advanced fingerboarding. This is literally more like the point where, I guess, the stuff we were talking about last session, beginners fingerboarding, like suddenly turns into advanced fingerboarding. I was using some just basic methodology of, as I say, finger isolation, but I was seeing these improvements. And I'd say that put a grade or two on my climbing. And then just like, we had at the sort of opening of the discussion, we recognized the point where you start to plateau. Similar with me, I guess I got some the lion's share of the benefit I got was just from doing it. But then I started to plateau, and then I started to look more diagnostically into what I could do to keep this, because I was really excited about it. It was work, I didn't want the party to finish. And so, I still am, in fact. I collaborate with the guys from Beastmaker quite a lot. We got various research projects we're doing with fingerboarding, blah, blah, blah. And, sort of continue these discussions with Dan about what I could keep doing for the party to continue. And then I started experimenting with some, different protocols, and, bringing in some other supportive exercises that you can kind of build in around the fingerboarding. And sure enough, I would say that, as a result of that, to this day, touch wood, it's still continuing. And I definitely see fingerboarding as a crucial supportive tool to bouldering. And you know, I recognize and I applaud those climbers who haven't needed it. But I would definitely say, and if you'd asked me this 15 years ago, I would have completely denied it and said the opposite. But asking me now, I would say that I'm one of those climbers who undoubtedly needs, you know, fingerboarding and bouldering kind of fit together like this for me in order to facilitate that progress.
That makes total sense, man. And Maddy, how about you?
Yeah, quite similar, especially because me and Neil probably are similar in the fact that we've got like a really big base in outdoor climbing. That was where like most of my climbing took place initially, and also on routes and trad climbing. So when it came to really wanting to progress my sport climbing, which I also really love, that process of red pointing, I realized that yes, strength, that more maximal end of strength, bouldering was definitely a relative weakness of mine. And I guess it was really holding me back. And, you know, the sport climbing we have here in the UK, I actually started fingerboarding in the lead up when I started getting into red pointing at Malham. It's a style that I love, but it's very finger intensive. And basically I realized I had relatively weak fingers. So I had climbed 8B, but it was probably a more technical 8B. With a lot of weight going through the feet. And it was Dave Mason was like, I could just show you how to board. So I guess like what we talked about in the beginners, he helped me warm up and just like get to the position where I was hanging off the fingerboard. I knew what sort of muscles I wanted to be engaging in my shoulders and the position I wanted to be opening up my fingers. And I think I could add like a few kilos, but he was basically like, this is terrible. So I realized that this was an area that I would have a lot to gain. And I think it's one of those things that we come across a lot, where if people had looked at me and said, I bet you've got really strong fingers. And I think for some reason we come to this conclusion when we see people climbing on small holds a lot. But I was climbing on small holds on actually very low angle, really climbing, and actually a lot of the weight is going through your feet. So essentially what I realized from the beginning was that I had a really big imbalance, I guess, within my finger strength between different grip types, between full crimp, and actually I'd either full crimp or drag, and I'm quite strong on like pockets. So I had a lot to gain from half crimp. And I think this really, I think some people think, oh, half crimp, that's like just what you do for training on the fingerboard. But since I've been training it, I really the benefit of using it as a position, because you get to use your thumb to stabilize on the rock. So last year I went to try, was it last year? No, it was the year before. I went to try a route called Magic Line with Hazel, which is an amazing line in Yosemite. But basically, it's a lot of off balance, sort of lay backing. And my half crimp was definitely lagging at that point. And so I had to full crimp. And this meant I was barn door. I didn't have that stability to be able to like use my thumb against the rock as well, which helped me really like stabilize at the shoulders, the core, connect to my whole body. And so when I sort of decided to troubleshoot why this was a bit, I realized that, first of all, literally just by looking at my, morphology, I'm quite hypermobile, both at my shoulders, my elbows, fingers. And I have had a few people say that they're the same. So I have like a lot of like slack in the system, I guess, when it comes to my fingers. They sort of split like quite far apart as well. Ooh. And so actually, I think this might be something that a few people out there who think I'm relatively weak at fingerboarding, this could be something that applies to them. And I also was quite imbalanced in muscles between my extensors and my forearms. I think because I crimp a lot, I was like working my extensors, which was almost overdeveloped. And actually my forearm muscle was quite weeny. And I think that's just like an interesting thing to look at, because actually literally by looking and feeling, people can maybe troubleshoot the areas of weakness. So I started with the bigger muscle groups. So I was weak on a fingerboard. So I worked my shoulders, everything up chain, everything that stabilized. And I actually did like forearm curls to hypertrophy, to build some muscle in my forearm. And I found for me that helped build quite a strong base. And then from then on the board, I'm really, for me personally, what's worked is focusing on the strength end of things and varying the stimulus in that area. So I guess when you become more advanced at fingerboarding and you do it for an extended period of time, you do have to change the training stimulus. And there's often this quite generic thought pattern out there of there's max hangs and there's repeaters, which is true. And that can be a very valid change of stimulus. But for me, who really struggles with that maximal side of things, I actually prefer changing the stimulus all within the strength end. So a way that I found really effective for me in doing that is actually a bit like what Neil said, is dropping the finger and doing front 3 and back 3 half crimp on 2 arms. And when I did that, I noticed that my back 3 was so weak in comparison to my front 3. So then again, straight away, I found this sort of little weakness in the system that I can slowly target. So I guess that's the way I've built up my fingerboarding to where it is now, in slowly refining the training to target certain elements that are weaknesses in my body as well as in my fingers. And then for me, just actually using the grip in climbing. So when I first started training on the fingerboard, I would lose it very quickly if I stopped. And I think this was because when I went climbing, I still only open-handed or half crimped, or full crimped, sorry. And so actually now for me, I really try and use it. And whether that's alongside the fingerboarding, doing quite basic half crimp problems on a board where you really force it. Obviously people at home might not have boards, but you could do this literally doing sort of movements between half crimps on your fingerboard. And I think it just helps translate that isometric strength that you've built into, that more climbing specific, actually taking the grip and using it and being confident enough to use it in that scenario. One of the mistakes I've made, well, 2 of the mistakes I've made along the way, which I think have really hindered my year-to-year progress and progress in an acute sense, are not maintaining. So I guess Neil mentioned doing a stint of fingerboard training and then obviously taking some time off, which I think some people can do this and they maintain it through climbing alone. I do not seem to maintain that. So I've had quite a few cycles, I guess, of training where I've trained and I've worked hard to get to a certain place with my fingerboarding. And then I come back a few months later and literally I'm back where I started years ago. So for me personally, I guess I have found that just putting that little bit of effort into maintaining it helps me to make year-on-year progress. And then one other thing that happened a few years ago when I really ramped up my training, and I think this is a mistake that I see for people who would look to do more advanced protocols in fingerboarding, because they're often pushing other areas of their training as well, is that I got myself into a state of what I guess we call low energy availability. So I essentially introduced a load of training that was quite new to me. It was weight training, conditioning sessions. I thought I ate enough. This is often what people think. I wasn't restricting my diet, but basically things gradually started to go quite downhill. I was making gains still in my big muscle groups. My fingerboarding fell off a cliff. And then I started to notice as well that, I guess, being a woman, I have this sort of useful red flag of my period. This started changing. My menstrual cycle lengthened. It was really light. And I realized that actually, when I decided to track what I was eating versus what I was doing, although it wasn't really low, I also probably wasn't matching my needs. And I think that is something people can think about if they are getting to this advanced level and they're either really seeing a reduction in performance, falling off a cliff, or maybe not making the gains that they need to make. So yeah, those are a few of the things that I've learned along the way.
That's super interesting. And so we've got a whole load of questions from UKC members who have been asking some stuff about advanced fingerboarding. So aside from having gone over our own experience with it, we've got a lot of interesting stuff to go through. Mostly, I think, it's as you guys are saying, that as you start fingerboarding, you might learn the 2 relatively basic exercises of max hangs and repeaters. And when I'm explaining fingerboarding to beginners as well, I sort of go, well, yeah, if you want to get stronger fingers, max hangs. If you want to get more endurance, do repeaters. And there's just those 2 sort of basic exercises. And that's great and they work. But exactly as you're saying, for training to be effective, you want it to be challenging and you want it to be stressful. And after a while, whilst it might have been challenging and stressful and helped you gain strength at first, your body becomes accustomed to it and it's not as stressful. And so then we need to start changing up to other routines to make it more varied. So question 1 from Matthew Coburn. He's asking about overcoming isometrics versus yielding isometrics. So overcoming isometrics, you two know this already. I double checked this before we started to make sure that I wasn't going to be caught out when we did this session. But overcoming isometrics, just for anyone who's not as clued up as Maddy and Neil and Matthew Coburn here, overcoming isometrics would be when you're fixed in place, pulling against something that isn't going to move. Whereas yielding isometrics are the much more common one, where you're hanging using a weight and you're trying to resist releasing that weight. So hanging off body weight or picking up a weight and trying to slowly release it. Those would be yielding isometrics. So Matthew's asking, why are yielding isometrics more popular, and do overcoming isometrics have any advantages? Maddy, you want to talk first? Oh, Neil, no, sorry, you looked ready.
I'm sure we've both got so much to say on this. I mean, it's more going to be like clipping our wings so we don't say too much. I think first up is that a lot of climbers are thinking, fingerboarding, I don't really want to do that. It sounds a bit dull, but you can just about say if you're hanging off something, it feels like climbing. And whereas if your feet are like glued to the floor, like hooked under a massive weight, and you're just pulling down, it feels pretty removed from climbing. And I guess that, if you want that kind of sensation of hanging from your fingers, you're not going to get that with overcoming. Now, there's a big caveat here. Anyone here can Google these things and you'll see a lot of facts. And it's often quite tempting to sort of go, oh, someone's done a study into this. This must be the gospel. And this must be, we can take this directly and translate it to climbing. We have to be very careful with this process. I mean, studies, lots of studies are being done now on hangboarding and on hangboarding protocols. We're learning things, but we're not in a position to say, as they are in certain other sports, this is the way. But if we do look into these things, what we'll see is that, overcoming, interestingly, is probably more popular in other sports than yielding. Really? Whereas with climbing, it's the other way around for the reasons that I've just given. Now, if you look into this, you'll see some things that are quite compelling about overcoming. One is that it's good. It's better for the sort of neurological side of things in terms of like recruiting fibers, but not so taxing in terms of fiber hypertrophy, which means actually kind of breaking the fibers down. This is relevant, I think, in two ways. Firstly, these climbers who we know about, who love training and who like doing lots of training and who often tell themselves that fingerboarding is a rest day. And it's like, well, actually, no, fingerboarding is not a rest day. You're pulling really hard on your fingers. However, if you use overcoming protocols, you're stressing, you're actually breaking down, you're not breaking down your muscles as much. So don't quote me on this, but if if we were to sort of try and take it like inferences from the research, it might suggest that this is something that we could do when we're trying to combine lots of forms of training concurrently whilst minimizing the fatigue element. However, and this is the big however, whilst it's understood to be less damaging on muscle fibers, it's pretty taxing on the nervous system, which is a form of fatigue that climbers often don't talk about. And like lots of certain types of climbing, certain types of stress can be neurologically fatiguing, even if they're not as fatiguing on your muscles. So overcoming is one of those things. I guess what we're saying here is that this is something that you should experiment with. And I would say that the main way it fits in is as a system shock, which is for someone like me, who's 99.999% of what I've done has been yielding. And if I start to plateau with that, then clearly I try overcoming as a way of kickstarting progress. There's another way that I think overcoming really fits in. Maddy was just talking about how, she does a stint of fingerboarding, then she wants to go climbing, quite rightly so. She doesn't keep up with fingerboarding. I get that as well. I'm the same. Because you don't want your fingerboarding session to tire you out. If you're going climbing, you're going to Malham at the weekend, you want to try your project, you don't want to do a fingerboarding session the day before. However, if you did overcoming, it might fatigue you less, and it might actually serve to really like keep you feeling sharp if it's more neurological, because it's firing muscle fibers, stimulating recruitment, but it's not causing so much hypertrophy. So it could, and I stress could, fit in that way. However, the backdrop is that we just have to try these things, because you might just find that you have, this is the topsy-turvy thing about training for climbing, you might just have the opposite experience.
And Maddy, what do you think?
Yeah, I think Neil's hit the nail on the head there, that I think we often get asked questions that are a bit like, why is it this one or this one? Is one better? And it's often not necessarily that one is like the way and the other way is like not the way. It's just a bit like, what do you have available to you? What is your training history? And maybe what works for you. I guess Neil's talked quite a bit about the more sort of physiological aspect there of kind of hypertrophy and building that muscle versus like the neurological recruitment in terms of like recruiting the different motor units. Maybe something that's quite useful for us to think about, given that we're in lockdown, is actually the equipment that each of these require. So the overcoming isometrics, essentially trying to move an immovable object. Some people out there, they might have been fingerboarding for a year now. There's not that many weights available. And so overcoming isometrics essentially is something that people could move on to or try if they no longer have enough weight to bring about the right strength stimulus for them when hanging off it. So I guess people often use yielding isometrics, quite rightly, because Neil pointed out we are like a body weight sport. So including the body weight in your training is, and like hanging off the fingers is just, quite obviously like a sport specific way of loading. It's also very easily measurable for most people because you have your body weight plus a certain amount of weight. And so it's very easy to overload, to gradually overload, which is what we want to do in training. Depending what equipment people have, if they have force plates at home, I do not know many people who have this, but they might do. And I know there's like apps that link to phones now and stuff like that. You could obviously just use overcoming isometrics. If you don't have this, then you're probably going to look to use your RPE. So how hard you feel like you're pulling into the fingerboard to gauge your progress. And I guess I feel like most people find that a little bit less motivating. They can't sort of see this progress so well. Some people, and this, I know people use this in finger rehab, you could stand on some scales and go single armed and sort of pull into it, but you're still sort of pulling off, but it gives you that way of measuring if you don't have the weights and the pulley and everything. I think Neil's really right that something that overcoming isometrics are useful for is extremely high intensity neurologically recruiting hangs. So maybe pulling really hard for like 3 to 5 seconds. And yeah, as Neil said, that might not cause as much like fatigue if you do want to go out climbing the next day or something like that. And actually it might help you with a state of readiness in that sort of neurological sense. Something I actually think that overcoming isometrics for me personally have been useful for is when I tweak a finger, which I have done recently because I did some board climbing stupidly after fingerboarding. But basically I am not at the stage, I'm so far away from a one-arm hang. But when we injure one finger, what we can do is look to, while we let that recover, I can maintain some overcoming isometrics with my good hand. And there's some studies that show that neurologically that helps maintain recruitment across the body. Although, as Neil said, it obviously won't cause any structural changes in this hand. So I'm doing some rehab, very light sort of finger holds with a block on my tweaked side. And then I can do an overcoming isometric. So I pull into the fingerboard, trying to essentially move it, but obviously I can't, for 10 seconds, and I'm just gauging that using RPE. So yeah, that was, I feel like Neil gave a good account of like the physiological side, and so maybe that was just a little bit of more logistical things that some people might consider.
No, that makes loads of sense. I was going to say that when you talked about the force plates things, that was actually my first experience getting into overcoming isometrics was getting. Do you know the Tindeck force plates? They're
yeah. I actually do have one downstairs. Just
so do I. I got one of those. So for anyone who doesn't know this, they're a lot cheaper and a lot smaller than the other force plates you can get, and they link to your phone with a Bluetooth app, which then tells you exactly how much output you're using. Because then that was then me trying overcoming isometrics for the first time. Although I did find exactly what you two were talking about, the idea of it being more neurologically stressful. If I have understood that correctly, then I did feel like for putting the same amount of weight as if I was to do a body weight hang, when I was doing overcoming isometrics, it felt like I was trying a lot harder than if I was just hanging body weight off the edges. That is the sort of thing we mean by neurologically stressful, right? Or maybe not.
Yeah.
Oh, it is.
Yeah. Essentially, I think you can often pull, like when, say in weights exercises or whatever, you can essentially like pull into that or push like maximally, you know, as hard as possible for the extended period of time. Because essentially, say for a 10-second, like pulling as hard as possible for 10 seconds, you are likely, if you had a force plate, to be pulling harder at the very start of the pull.
Yeah.
And then obviously that force that you are exerting will likely drop over the 10 seconds, but at every point it's maximal. Whereas if you have to hold our weight up off the floor against gravity, this load is consistent throughout the whole 10-second hang. So that's where the neurological element comes in.
Well, okay, so first, this is from Matthew Coburn again, and it's our first of quite a few questions about the differences between one and two-arm hangboarding. So we've got quite a few of these to come up, but first one asking specifically one-arm versus two-arm hangs. Do one-arm hangs have any particular advantage over two-arm hangs? I've got some ideas, but Maddy, what do you think?
Yeah, well, I guess a little bit like the overcoming and yielding isometrics. I think you've just got two different positions here. So first of all, logistically, for people in lockdown, it might be that you reach the point where with two arms, you've maxed out on your weight. And it might be that when you use a pulley and assistance, the weight that you have on that is now sort of well balanced, that you can keep getting that maximal stimulus, like say if you are doing max hangs. So quite a few people I know just make that shift because the amount of weight is uncomfortable around them. You know, you start getting sort of to 150% body weight or a bit over, and actually that is just quite heavy potentially on people's backs. But actually it obviously is a different hanging position, so it uses different muscles, especially up chain, so like, you know, from your fingers up to your shoulder, and there's more of a stability element as well with the one arm hang. And so this can be useful for people in a sort of different scenarios in terms of the climbing goals they want to achieve. So you can imagine that you are obviously in a much more extended position, although obviously you're always wanting to be engaged at the shoulder. And so I know that quite a lot of people say if they're into bouldering, where you are often in much more extended positions and you are likely wanting to catch a hold at that very extended position, be able to hold it like that, then that might be quite useful for them to do, particularly short climbers, maybe, who find themselves really extended a lot, because essentially you can recruit different muscles down the chain, and actually that hanging position can maybe help you feel stronger in that position when you're on the wall, or just also more able to actually engage your fingers at the end of a more extended position. So I guess those are the main things that I find. A few people, given that they are fingerboarding quite a lot in lockdown, guys, I guess particularly with their shoulder width, depending on what fingerboard you've got, you can start to build up, like, I guess, feelings of impingement, discomfort around the shoulders, because essentially for people who are broad, the fingerboard is almost narrow for them, for their shoulders. Or potentially people have a history of certain impingement at the shoulder, and they actually just find it more comfortable, even if they need quite a lot of assistance on the pulley, to hang in a one-armed position, as long as they've sort of prepared their shoulder for that position. And that might be like impingement at the front, or potentially at the back. But I do just think that moving between the two, for people who have now invested quite a lot of time in two-arm fingerboarding, it just offers that change in stimulus that we've sort of talked about, potentially if people have plateaued at two-arm hangs.
And Neil, what do you reckon?
I don't think I can add anything to that.
No, I've not got much. I think, what do you two think about it being, Maddy, you were somewhat talking about this already with regards to one-arm hangs being more relevant to bouldering. I've kind of always had it in my head as, not that two-arm hangs aren't specific to climbing, because obviously they are. You're holding on to holds at body weight sometimes. I kind of always viewed one-arm hangs as slightly more specific for hard climbing, because if you're catching bad holds, you're more likely to be going for it with one hand. But is that not so much the case? What do you two think?
I just think they're both super relevant.
Yeah.
I mean, equally, like, what bouldering doesn't involve, like, two-arm pulling on really, really small crims. I think, Maddy really nailed it when she just said that, in a way, that the very question itself underpins one of the most sort of obvious ways that you can change the structure of your training. like, because remember that the biggest thing we find as climbers is there's just so many things to train, and we can't train everything all at once, and we shouldn't be tempted to train everything all at once. We need to identify a certain thing, run with it for a period. Then when we feel it's starting to expire, we change it and flick it round. And the classic one would be a phase of fingerboarding, which is focused on larger grips, higher loads. And for an advanced level climber, that means one-arm hangs. They run with that for a bit, and then they change it to a smaller grip with lower load levels. That's two-arm hangs, and that's just a classic and obvious change. And I think when you're doing one particular thing, focus on the benefits that that's giving you, and don't think about, don't think of it as a giant sieve that's leaking. Just enjoy doing there's so many different ways of doing it, but maybe you could start off with the kind of start off with a campaign of one-arm hangs and then change to a campaign of two-arm hangs, and then or next time do it differently, start off with two-arm then go to one-arm, but you need to do both, and both offer advantages.
Perfect. There we go. Well, then, last question from Matthew Coburn. A little bit more jargon, so I'm going to clear it up before we start. I know you two know what it means, but just for anyone who's listening, Matthew's asking isometric versus isotonic exercises. Are there any useful isotonic finger exercises, or is it best to stick to isometrics? So I've understood this as isometrics means the muscle stays under tension at the same length, whereas isotonic would be it stays under tension, but the length of the muscle changes. Assuming I've got that right, which one's better?
In a way, I'm going to approach this the same way as I approached the previous question about overcoming. In climbing, the fingers work statically. Like doing a climbing move doesn't, unless you're, I don't know, maybe someone like Magnus Lindstedt or Jan Hoyer, doesn't involve taking a hold like that and going and pulling yourself up using your fingers. You hold the hold isometrically. Isometric meaning same length, meaning that the muscles don't move. They're in a static position. So we train specifically to the sport, and that's why we tend to train the fingers statically. However, Maddy dropped something in earlier which was brilliant. She's saying how when she first embarked on the fingerboarding campaign, she actually realized that before doing that, she had to just build some basic strength in the belly of her forearm, and what better way to do that than wrist curls. So this identifies a way that let's call it dynamic, to use a language that people perhaps understand better, but meaning isotonic meaning moving strength. An obvious way where it fits in would be to build that base. Even for a climber, who's got a decent level of strength in the forearms, is a more advanced climber. I still think that type of base work fits in perhaps at the start of a fingerboarding campaign, doing some sort of heavy wrist curls or that type of thing. We could go really into the sort of depths of all the kind of research that surrounds this, again, with the caveat that a lot of it isn't specific to climbing. But one thing that we can glean is that perhaps more powerful than, or more relevant to climbing than isotonic is kind of like a type of training that's almost like a cross between isotonic and isometric, whereby you isolate a very small range of the movement and you move through that and then maybe hold a position either end, or hold a position. So rather than, like, say, for example, if we were on a fingerboard, rather than like completely lowering ourselves all the way down or completely trying to pull ourselves all the way up, we would just do a little part of the movement. We would hold there, we would lower, and then we would hold there. That's like, it's what's called isodynamic training. The reason that's understood to be pretty good is because you can handle higher forces than you can with purely isotonic training. And this is why, again, the other thing about isometric static is that you can handle higher forces than you can with isotonic. But this isodynamic, where it's like moving, but it's moving within a shorter range of motion and between static positions, it's almost like you're getting the best of both worlds. So if I was going to try and apply it purely to fingerboarding, I would be going isodynamic rather than isotonic. And I would be built, but if I was going purely like isotonic, as in moving, I would be doing it more as base work.
Okay. And Maddy, what are your thoughts on this?
Before I go delve into the isotonic and isometrics, there was just one other thing that I thought, based on that single arm versus two-arm hangboarding in the previous question, which was just that something I do see when people move to single arm and they follow protocols, often we are a little bit imbalanced. This is quite natural. But if you are very imbalanced, maybe more than like 5% difference, which can and has been shown to play into injury risk in your fingers, actually 2-arm can be good to stick to balance out imbalances. So potentially for people, if they've been doing 1-arm and they actually think, wow, I'm opening up a bit of a gap here because they're pushing different weights on the 2 arms, to sort of maximize both. Going back to 2-arm and trying to balance that out, sticking to a load to both hands can be useful. I think Neil's sort of gone through a lot of it there. I actually think that isotonics can be quite useful. So although once we grab a hold, we have it isometrically, the process of if we slow mode grabbing a hold, we would go like this, and then we would bend our fingers from it. So that is a sort of a dynamic part of that process of gripping something. So I think that it can be useful in base work. Neil's right, as soon as you start moving a weight versus doing it isometrically, you can't handle as much load, but the reason you can't do that is because you're moving through a bigger range of motion. So I think, wrist curls, sort of extensor and flexor, as well as on a weight sort of either with a dumbbell for like more like open hand strength, or if people have a little edge, people can actually like do it with an edge, and you will probably find you might even be quite surprised at how much you have to reduce the load by in order to be working through a range of motion. But I think that can work well to really either sort of vary the stimulus or to go alongside fingerboarding, like max strength fingerboarding, because I actually think it's a bit easier with finger curls and sort of isotonic movements to get that burn, I don't know, a pump, and go into that more like hypertrophy pump range. And I think it can be quite an effective way of doing that. And it also, because you do it sort of down by your side, you get to reduce overhead work potentially. One other sort of population, I guess, where I find that this sort of isotonic training can be useful, or that maybe they prefer it compared to a lot of fingerboarding, is slightly older population. You take your knuckle, you get to move your knuckles through a full range of motion. People may be starting to get like discomfort around the knuckles from hanging a lot of load in an isometric position. If you maybe switch to moving it through the range using a lower load, they might find that is a useful switch for them to make.
That's really good to know. Okay, so actually, we were going back to questions about 1-arm hangs just a second ago. And now we're going to go straight back there again because we've got more to ask. So we talked a little bit about the idea of moving between 2 and single-arm hangs just based on, I've run out of weight, so I need to make it harder, or depending on what facilities we've got at home. But Frederick _Iglis is asking, specifically when should I move on to one or assisted one-hand pulls? Just in case there's any other information. Do either of you have any specific markers of, when you can hang this edge with 2 arms with this percentage of body weight, now is the time to do 1-arm hangs, or is it a little bit looser than that? Neil, you want to tell us about it?
You can't make generalizations about this. I've just always worked on the basis with fingerboard training that if you're noticing gains and something's improving, for goodness sake, don't stop it and move on just for the sake of it. The obvious time, if you're working on, 2-arm and it's been great, it's been going well, and then you look back at your data for your last 2 or 3 sessions and you've seen no improvement, maybe you give it, you do the obvious questions like, am I sleeping, am I eating okay, do I feel fresh and recovered? And if the answer to all those things is yes, and you're not making any improvements, that's a sure sign to me that you need to make the switch, and you make the switch. And this is where the best training programs are always flexible, and you're constantly reviewing what you do, and you say, well, I plan to make the switch at this point, but I'm going to make it earlier or I'm going to make it later. I just don't think there are no fixed rules with this part of the game.
Maddy, what do you reckon?
Yeah, I'm along the same lines. I guess I'll just go for, because I don't think we can be like super prescriptive here, I'll just go for me personally, what I'm planning to do. So I've never done 1-arm hangs yet because I don't think I'm there. And when I get to around 150% body weight, I might go to make that switch. It's not like I'll switch all over to 1. I will probably do still do a 2 session, using a certain protocol, but I might start to build some one-arm hangs in there. And that's partly because I want to start working that extended position, but also a little bit because I think for me, 150% would be adding 30 kilos to me. I'm sort of down in the sort of low 20s, but it feels quite heavy for me to add. So, but that's really more of like a personal time frame. And I think one of the things that is useful to people to think about if they are looking to make that switch at a certain sort of self-prescribed, level, maybe someone else is thinking, yeah, at 150%, I'd quite like to start incorporating some single arms hangs because I think they're good for me for a number of other reasons. What they could start doing, which is what I'm doing, is really making sure you work that single arm hanging position, so on a jug or a bar, but being able to hang engaged and start holding weight in the other hand. Hammer curls could be good to work the sort of brachyradialis, so like you're sort of looking for those stabilizing muscles so that when you're hanging one-armed on a fingerboard, you're not getting limited by other elements of that hanging position. And so I think they mentioned pulls as well, which I think is maybe pulling on a fingerboard. Mixed views from people I speak to about this, in terms of like going from obviously loading the fingerboard to doing a pull-up. Some people like edge pulls, and I think they can be useful when you're starting to really sort of filter towards a peak, because obviously it's quite specific, because in climbing, we get a hold and we pull on it, and it's probably not a jug like the fingerboard, like the pull-up bar. But I would always think a little bit about the elbows. So once you're in that position and you're doing like quite heavy pulls to target strength, people might really want to just look after their elbows. And also I think it's for people to think, what is limiting that training exercise? So if you're doing an edge pull, you likely can't add as much weight as a max pull-up. And so, you're always you're going to be limiting one of the movements when you start to like add together both a sort of bigger muscle pulling and the isometric fingerboard.
That's really good advice to break it down into those smaller sections.
Can I?
Oh, go on, Neil, go on.
Well, no, I just want to apologise for misunderstanding the first question. I thought I thought someone was asking within a cycle when they should make that switch. But if the question was more, when are they ready to start one-arm hangs? I mean, I don't have an issue with doing one-arm hangs relatively early on in the scheme of things, providing, as Maddy says, you can start off on a larger hold, even start off on a jug in order to practice the kind of shoulder engagement side of things. But if you want to do it on a 25 mil edge, just do it with a pulley rig with some assistance. I don't think I don't have an issue with that. But I do just want to put in it, also Maddy moved on to talk about fingertip pull-ups, and I really want to stress that I want to agree, but I want to both simultaneously agree and disagree with Maddy, because that's the kind of wacky nature of climbing, because training for climbing, because I'm from that generation where everyone used to do fingertip pull-ups on a fingerboard and nail themselves, like, chronic elbow tendonitis, surgery, people giving up climbing as a result of fingertip pull-ups, the whole 9 yards. However, that was before antagonist training was discovered. And also a lot of those climbers were holding the full locked position. I personally think that if you, first of all, are an experienced climber and have a reasonable base, which I'm hoping most of the people watching this conversation do. Secondly, if you warm up. Thirdly, if you don't hold the locked position. And fourth, if you're really diligent about training your antagonist, in particular doing forearm extensor work, but also doing press ups, I don't think that, I think that fingertip pull-ups are a devastatingly effective exercise. And I mean, some of the more like, in a way, these things go around about circle. I've seen some of the more like modern, what I would call like hardcore coaches who are training some of the like, 9A plus and above climbers. Their base phase just involves hundreds of fingertip pull-ups. It's the sort of stuff that someone from my generation looks at and goes, oh, but how come that, I remember talking to, like Adam Ondra about this. And I was like, God, what about your elbows? He's like, oh yeah, no, it's just the antagonist to balance it. So, this stuff, it's always, as we, almost any conversation about training, it's like a cost benefit analysis. And the surefire way to not get injured by fingertip pull-ups is to not do them. But you can do them. But if you do them, just make sure you tick those boxes that I've just listed.
Well, that actually...
And it might be that sort of, especially for people during lockdown, if you're not climbing as well, then actually you are also just much less likely to be, overloading and like sort of not getting the fine balance between working the pulling muscles and working your antagonists. Whereas I guess a lot of people, they sort of bring in fingertip pull-ups, but they're also climbing on their board or climbing outside. But that's interesting that a lot of people use it in base training. I guess for me, I usually think about working elements and then like funneling them towards a peak. And towards that peak might be fingertip pull-ups, because obviously you're getting more and more specific with the understanding that you might be limiting certain areas of the training by not isolating them. But yeah.
I mean, I'd love to just drop something in here, because this is something that I've, as I say, massively reviewed, because I was one of those coaches who for years said, don't do fingertip pull-ups, they will injure your elbows. This was my soundbite. And it's something that I've been forced to massively rethink, because, when you hear about like what Pachuzo Biaga's doing for Adamondra, and you see the results on the crag, and then you're like, well, and like Magnus Lindstedt and like, Ramon Gillian, all these people who do loads of fingertip pull-ups, you think, well, how can this be? And so I started doing fingertip pull-ups again, having, and this is someone who, golfer's elbow historically was my most, like, if you like, career threatening injury that I used to have a lot when I was younger, before we knew about antagonist training. So I thought, right, okay, I'm going to try this with antagonist training. And I just didn't find that I had any problem with them at all. But I also noticed that, wow, I just felt that raw pulling power just came back into my climbing. And then I started inputting this into my coaching and, into the sessions that I prescribe for people. But of course, I was initially only targeting those people who I thought, the last thing you want to do in the world is somebody get injured. So I was like picking out the people. I was thinking, I'm going to give you a go with this. You seem like, the sort of character. And they'd get back and go, thanks for the training program, loved it. I've got to say, the best part of all was the first like fingertip pull-up pyramid session. My gains went off the scale with that. And so that increased my confidence as a coach to set that session and start trickling it down more towards people who I thought were on the cusp. I had a conversation with someone, start of this lockdown, a chap in his late 50s. He's like, I'm not doing those fingertip pull-ups you've set for me. I'm too scared of them. And we had this to and fro. And I was like, I honestly think you've just got to give him a try. Do I explained all the things that he needed to do. And he did them. And he reported back. He was like, this was the best part of the training program. I can only report back the real live experiences of people. For me, we can read around subjects, we can research subjects, but when you try something with a real person and you get some feedback from that person, I think that's the thing we have to listen to most. So I just, as much as I know it's more fashionable to have conversations about, max hangs, density hangs, recruitment hangs, it's all about dead hanging. I just want to put in here that I feel that I've seen more benefits from people just doing fingertip pull-ups than I'm not saying I haven't seen benefits in dead hanging, but I would just say that we can't write fingertip pull-ups off.
Well, actually, I was going to say apologies to Frederick. Well done, both of you, for talking so much about fingertip pulls, because that's what this question was supposed to be about. Okay. And I forgot to mention the word pulls, which Frederick.
Oh, right. Well, good. We've done that one then.
Oh, that's a lovely closing statement, and generally a festival of knowledge about advanced fingerboarding today. So thank you both for joining us and sharing that knowledge. We've only actually got about halfway through the list of questions that we wanted to do today, so we will be back again for the next half. But until then, it's goodbye from me, goodbye Maddy, and goodbye Neil, and we'll see you all next time.
I look forward to seeing you next time.